morning, everyone. Hope you're doing okay. A little late getting this up, but we're going to start we're uploading these videos probably a couple times a week, but I'm going to try for 2 times a week so we stay on schedule. So, up first, we have the outbreak of World War II. This was what I was going to talk about before spring break, but I was away for a conference, so I'm moving it to today. So we'll talk about the outbreak of World War II, and then another series of videos, we'll talk about the Allied response to World War II, mostly when the United States enters the war in 1941. So this is probably well-known information. World War II is the war of choice. You walk into any bookstore, walk into Barnes & Noble, well, when it opens again. You can walk into Barnes & Noble, a lot of books on World War II. It's a lot of interest these days in World War II, when before it may have been the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. So, 2 main powers sort of defy the League of Nations. We talked about the League of Nations before spring break. We have Japan on one side, and then we have Germany on the other, seeking expansion. So, when we talk about Japan, this is a world history course, you might talk about how Japan, for much of the 19th century, is very much a feudal state. It was very rural. There was no modernization efforts at all. It wasn't even industrialized. And that changes by about 1853, when a new emperor comes to power, Meiji, and there are quick modernization efforts. So they industrialize very rapidly. So by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they've got shipping, they've got railroads connecting the small towns together, and modernizing the economy. So this all seems very good. The problem is that Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources. So the negative is they start becoming kind of the bully, because they're the industrial power in the East now, and China is very much unindustrialized. So they invade. In 1931, they invade Manchuria, which is north. I'll show you a map here. It's north of Korea, and they do this for oil. They do it for rubber. They do it for other natural resources that they didn't have in Japan. So, and they did this without warning. They didn't declare war. They just invaded. So this goes right against the League of Nations, the rules of global war, because they don't want the League of Nations. They want to prevent a World War II. So if World War II is anything, it shows that the League of Nations basically failed, and there's reasons why they did. So Japan invades Manchuria. Here's a map of Manchuria, this region here, north of Korea. Rich in natural resources. Japan invades. In Europe, we have famously the Nazis coming to power in the 1930s. They are democratically elected. They promise to make Germany great again. Pardon the Trumpist pun there, but that is the goal. The Weimar Republic, Germany was suffering. They had huge debts because they had to pay for all the World War I debt. They had huge inflation, rampant inflation. Right? Money was so plentiful that it wasn't worth anything. So people were burning it in their stoves for fuel because there was just so much of it. So that's the bad part of that. Government just issuing money when it doesn't have any sort of gold standard or anything like this to kind of fall back on. So that's sort of the worst part of fiat currency. So the Nazis come to power, promising to make Germany a great power once again, led by a man named Adolf Hitler. I'm sure he's familiar to you. He's sort of the dictator to beware of in the 20th century. We have 2 really big ones: Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. He's elected chancellor, and he eventually takes over and becomes Führer, leader of the Third Reich. This new age of German supremacy. He is a veteran of World War I, and while he's imprisoned briefly for instigating a revolution called the Beer Hall Putsch. He's in charge of this. He's arrested, and he's put in prison. And in prison, he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggles, what that means. And he writes this sort of narrative, seeing world history as a clash of races. So we have different ways of analyzing world history. The Marxists would see world history as a clash of identity, mostly class identity. So the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Mein Kampf sees as a clash of races. I've got it here. Aryans, white Aryans, and Nordic races are on top. And on the bottom, Slavic, Jewish, African peoples make up the lower class of this. So this is eugenics sort of writ large. The idea of a white supremacy in an extreme case. Hitler gets his ideas from this man. This is an American. This is Madison Grant. He was a lawyer and a zoologist. He was a eugenicist. Popular in the 1920s, he writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race. Here's a cover of it here. This is published in the early 20th century, and it sees history as a clash of races. Again, the passing of the great race is the white race. So Hitler reads this book, he's fascinated by it, and he echoes some of these themes in Mein Kampf. The idea of eugenics wasn't born with the Nazis. They got a lot of it from the United States. We were doing a lot of eugenics, the Eugenics Record Office, keeping tabs on people, who they married, IQ tests, all kind of stuff. The Nazis, when they have Lebensborn, their eugenics program, bring a lot of that knowledge from the U.S. So, we're not always the good guys. Hitler, when he takes over, in order to create, another German empire, you need land. So he sort of envisioned an Aryan empire that's actually based on art as well. He was very much an art. He was a failed artist, if you remember. He didn't get into art school twice in Vienna. And he wanted several things. He wanted an empire of all Aryans, and he wanted an empire based on the arts. Good lesson that studying art and studying classical music doesn't necessarily make you a great person. Hitler saw the eastern part of Europe as fertile land for settlement. So Austria, Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, so-called. So he does, of course, invade France, but he's looking to the east. When his first steps are really toward the east. So he annexes Austria and the Sudetenland, and of course what happens is Britain and France are watching this, and they're like, well, if we give him Austria, maybe he won't grow any further. Hitler even promised, I'm just trying to create an empire here the way you guys had, so we'll take over Austria and that'll be it. And then he'd move to the Sudetenland, and then they would, no, this is it. I won't move any further. So Britain and France practiced what was called appeasement. It's a good lesson in the problems of not having enough nationalism. So I had a great professor at the University of Florida say that the problem with World War I was he had too much nationalism. The problem with World War II is that you didn't have enough. And so they want to avoid a conflict, so they're just like, well, give him what he wants and he'll stop. This changes when he invades Poland. In 1939, he invades Poland, and that is seen as the last straw. So Britain and France declare war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. In the U.S., meanwhile, in the U.S. is very isolationist. This has long been a U.S. tradition. So where you kind of keep to yourself, you disband the military. After major wars, they did this during the Revolutionary War. They did this during the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, even World War I. The United States, a lot of politicians saw that a big army is unnecessary and it's a threat to democracy. So the United States had a very small army after World War I. I think Romania was bigger. I think the army of Romania was even larger. So this isolationist idea. Congress passed a Neutrality Act that basically said, we're going to stay the heck out of this. Although Franklin Roosevelt, being an East Coaster, was very interested in European affairs. This is kind of typical of sometimes East Coast politicians are more interested in Europe, where in the Midwest they tend to be more isolationist. So you get this conflict today with Donald Trump. You got sort of a lot of his supporters from the Midwest and the rural parts wanting to be isolationist. And you have the sort of East Coast elite looking to Europe and looking to the globalists being globally minded. So that clash of those two ideas. So Roosevelt's interested in European affairs. And in 1940, the government leases destroyers to Britain. Britain kind of becomes a colony of the United States. Kind of ironic, as the U.S. The colonies were originally under Britain's yoke before the Revolutionary War. So leasing destroyers and eventually weapons to Britain and France in 1941 through the Lend-Lease program. So the goal was here, we're going to lend you weapons and you can give them back to us. I mean, who's going to actually do that? Who's going to give your weapons back after you use them? But this was the idea. So the United States is kind of taking sides here. They are taking sides with Britain and France in this conflict. Meanwhile, there's an embargo on Japan. U.S. places an embargo on Japan because of its invasions of Manchuria. That happened about a decade earlier. So this embargo on Japan, it's not technically an act of war. It's just an economic embargo. You're not blocking their trade routes or anything like that. That would be an act of war. However, Japan would eventually see this as an act of war. So Japan says, screw you to the United States, takes over Indonesia, Malaysia, and Indochina, and, of course, famously attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. naval base in Hawaii. This is the famous Day of Infamy, if you remember reading about Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech to Congress, the Day of Infamy. Here's a picture of what happened at Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure if this is the Arizona. One of the battleships is destroyed. There's this air raid on Pearl Harbor. And if you look at it today, if you ever go there, it's considered a sacred place. I've been there. It's very haunting. It's very moving. This is the Arizona Memorial, and the Arizona just sits under the water here. You can kind of see the shadow of it here, and this is the memorial. And so what happens, the Arizona actually leaks oil. It leaks. There's still oil in the Arizona, and there's still bodies in the Arizona, so that they never got in there and got all the bodies out. So it's sacred burial ground. And so they call that oil leaking from the Arizona Tears of the Arizona. Like I said, it's very moving to be there. If you get a chance to go when the pandemic lifts, when things sort of ease, pandemic calms down a little bit. If you get a chance to go, do check it out. Very moving experience. So, just to finish up here, and I'll finish up quickly, we have allies on one side, Britain, France, United States, and the Soviet Union. And the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. It's easy to see these as good guys and bad guys. This is American history, and a lot of high school history is taught this way. Complicates it a little bit when you consider the eugenics issue that came from the United States. So we'll talk next time about the Allies, the Allied response, because the early years of the war are Axis victories. The Allies are really hammered, hit hard, mostly due to blitzkrieg warfare, which is kind of this lightning strike the Germans want to avoid. This kind of trench warfare in World War I, so they have the tanks and the airplanes, so it's kind of lightning strikes, these bombings, fast motion of military motion, moving your soldiers in and out, so to avoid sort of this gridlock. So the early years were, of course, Axis victories. Next time we'll talk about Allied response. So see you in a few.